more of a social hour, so we're not going to record that part just so we can all feel that personal space. But we just really hope this is going to be an inspiring event to really build unity and kind of motivate each other to continue this work, because I think all of us here today know that we still have a lot of work left to do. So my name is Jenna, and I'm with Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance. We're one of the 5 organizations that kind of threw this event together kind of last minute. And so I'll give a shout out to the other events here, or the other sponsors here in a minute. And then today also, I'm very happy that there's a few young women that really inspire me that are going to be helping us out today. So thank you guys. It's kind of one of the goals of NASCA is to really find a way to connect with these people younger than us and amplify their voices, because they're so important and really the future of our communities, our democracy, and our planet. So that's exciting. So really we're here today to kind of really connect these 2 issues of gender and environmental justice. And of course, the connections go on forever. But really, we wanted to put this event on to just kind of highlight the importance of coming together. Some of you may be more focused on gender issues, some of you more on environmental issues, but I think the message really is that we need to grow both of these movements by as much as we can. So we need everyone, even those who don't identify as environmentalists or those who don't identify as feminists. Somehow we need to find a way just to come together and fight for justice and equality. So I'm really excited that we were able to use today to kind of do that. And so I just want to give a shout out to Prescott Indivisible, Yavapai Women's March, Planned Parenthood. I think I saw Sarah here, which is going to talk to us later, and Defend Our Future. And I'm going to pass it over to Carrie, who is going to introduce NASCA and our guest speaker today.
Hi, everybody. It's so good to see everyone. And thanks to all the people that helped us make phone calls yesterday, just reminding everybody to come, and we've had a great turnout. So I just want to thank you for being here. I'm Jenna's co-organizer in the West region, based in Prescott, but work in Cottonwood and Kingman as well, and Cave Creek. So NASCA is a local grassroots people-powered movement in Northern Arizona, and we're hoping to expand the youth throughout Arizona, connecting on climate change. Our mission is to educate and empower people to take action against the negative impacts of climate change. NASCA is a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization because we believe that we must all come together to fight the climate change crisis. As a nonprofit, okay, here's my little spiel. So it's kind of like pass the hat or pass the jar. Back in the day when we used to meet in person, we used to ask for little donations, just your pocket change. And so Jenna's going to drop in the chat box our link to our little donate button. We are a 501c3, so we do ask for small donations that helps with like printing and some just basic costs of, virtually organizing for now. So we have amazing volunteers throughout Northern Arizona. I really want to kind of change the vernacular of volunteering in 2021. Jenna and I've really been working on trying to empower people to just get more involved with our environmental climate action movement. So we're just calling it Join the Movement, because sometimes people hear volunteer and they think, oh my gosh, I'm gonna, have a lot of work to do. But, the idea is that everybody gets to do a little bit, and we all work together and we build the capacity that way. So she's gonna put the link in the chat box. Sign up to volunteer, or just share our links with your friends, and let's start building this movement. We can't do it without your help. So if you have 5 minutes or 5 hours to spare, we will find a place for you in our community. We're so glad that you're here today. So without any more talk about Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance, I'm going to introduce Dr. Frances Julia Riemer. Dr. Riemer is an educational anthropologist, feminist, and self-described traveler extraordinaire. She has worked and traveled in the US, Europe, East and South Africa, the Middle East, Southern Asia, and Latin America alone as part of a team, a couple, a nuclear and extended family. Her ethnographic research focuses on change and issues of equity and access, gender, development and sustainable communities, women's crafts and tourism, and cultural difference, and the social organization of community, school, and workplace. Dr. Riemer is a Fulbright scholar, and her work has been supported by the Spencer Foundation and the National Academy of Education. She organizes for progressive policies locally and nationally and speaks on women's suffrage, the ERA, and gender and climate change. She is also an ASCA board member, and she does a lot of great work just within her own community, living in Sedona and working up in Flagstaff. So let's give a round, warm welcome to Frankie for her presentation.
Hey, thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us and for joining NASCA for this virtual Women's March. And thanks, of course, Carrie and Jenna for your production assistance, and Raina and Sydney for joining us and giving us backup. So I am so excited. I'm really, I've been like sort of squirming in my chair. I'm so excited to join you all at the end of such a jubilant week. Here is to feeling hopeful again. Woo, woo. What an optimistic time to celebrate. Just 2 days ago, we saw our newly inaugurated president sign executive orders to recommit to the Paris Climate Change Agreement and revoke a permit for the Keystone oil pipeline. President Biden has elevated the climate crisis to one of his highest priorities and ordered federal agencies to start reviewing and reinstating more than 100 environmental regulations that were weakened or rolled back by former President Donald J. Trump. Woo! And I have to think that, you know, much of that work, much of what happened, much of what we saw is the power of people and the power of women coming together and strengthening our commitment to serve the causes of justice. And I've worked with many of you, and hopefully that we will see the end, or we'll see the management of COVID as well soon. And so those of you that I have not worked with closely, I look forward to doing that in the not so distant future. We celebrate the hard work we've done over the past 4 years, right? We celebrate in this moment of moving forward instead of pushing back. So now's the time in these moments of opportunity to make real change, right? To take advantage of this moment to really do something. To promote justice for ourselves, our families, our communities, and our planet. So as we move forward, I've been thinking about how important, how imperative it is to understand the relationships among the crises and the movements that we're experiencing. Global warming, the coronavirus pandemic, the economy, and racial and gender injustices, all central causes of the Biden administration. Right? So, how does this all come together? How do women come together to address climate change? So what I want to say today, and I want to start sharing my screen. Let's see if this works. Oh, there we go. Is climate and gender go hand in hand. And addressing climate change is addressing gender equity. I have a lovely quote here. It's from a climate activist, Logan Dreyer. Climate change, like other disasters, maps onto existing inequalities in our society. And we know that now, and we've seen that with COVID as well, right? A trans woman afraid to sleep in a hurricane evaluation center is living at the intersection of the climate crisis and patriarchy. Indigenous women whose breast milk is poisoned by pollution also live in this place. No person lives a single issue life. As environmental feminists have demonstrated again and again, climate justice and gender justice are the same struggle, and we must treat them as such. Oh. And to quote one of my favorite poets, Audre Lorde, the self-described Black lesbian mother warrior poet, there is no such thing as single issue struggles because we do not live single issue lives. So I want to note from the start that when we're talking about the word woman or feminine, we have to recognize that woman is defined and conceptualized differently, right, across cultures. And we have to remember that we have to remember that woman does not only apply to what we're now calling cis women, right? Those of us whose gender identity and gender expressions match the biological sex assigned at birth. But we're also including trans women, feminine identifying gender queer, and non-binary folks. So climate change and gender, if climate change and gender go hand in hand, it's because women and LGBT plus folks are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And they are also effective actors or agents of change in relationship to both mitigation and adaptation. And we are essential to conversations about climate justice. So when we talk about climate justice or environmental justice, we're addressing the notion of intersectionality. And anybody who teaches in women's and gender studies always loves to talk about Kimberly Crenshaw, American lawyer, civil rights advocate, Columbia law professor, who introduced the notion of intersectionality in her 1989 Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. So Crenshaw was looking at court cases and she observed that she was looking at race and sex discrimination cases, and she observed that Black women, historically lacking race, gender, and class privilege, consistently had their discrimination claims denied. And these reflections caused Crenshaw to describe intersectionality as a framework to trace the impact of racism, sexism, other modes of discrimination, where they come together and create sometimes unique circumstances, obstacles, barriers for people who are subject to all of those things. So climate justice is the way that intersectionality is operationalized by climate change movements. And then climate change becomes an ethical and a political issue, not purely an environmental or physical issue. And it most adversely affects those least responsible for climate change. Climate change affects everyone. Some bear the brunt of it. And one of my favorite quotes by the Prime Minister of, why do I do this all the time? Iceland, not Ireland, Iceland. Katrín Jakobsdóttir. In our actions against climate change, we need to fight for climate justice. Human rights, social justice, and gender equality are all intrinsically connected to the fight because climate change affects the poor more than the rich, the underprivileged more than the privileged, and women differently than men. So climate change and gender go hand in hand, right? So why are women and LGBTQ folks particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change? Well, first there's poverty. So while the statistics on poverty are sort of a moving target, we do know that across the globe, women and girls living in poverty in particular face higher risks and greater burdens from the impact of climate change. Women and girls are often the last to eat, the last to be rescued. They face greater health and safety risks as water and sanitation systems become compromised, and they take on increased domestic care as resources dwindle. When coupled with unequal access to resources and to decision-making processes, limited mobility for women in rural areas puts them in a position where they're disproportionately affected by climate change. This is particularly true when gender and race intersect. So for women of color who bear the double burden of gender and racial discrimination, and are most often economically and politically marginalized, they have the hardest time coming back after climate disasters. And given employment discrimination for transgender individuals, retaining a job or seeking new employment, we know, is particularly challenging. So women are also involved with food security. Across the world, women farmers account for anywhere between 45 to 80% of all food production. About 2/3 of the female labor force in the global South and 90% in many African countries are engaged in agricultural work. And of course, we know that with climate disaster, traditional food sources become more predictable and scarce. Women also lose income as well as harvests, and related increases in food prices make food more inaccessible for poor people, and in particular to women and girls whose health has been found to decline more than men's health in times of food shortages. Deforestation. We know that when we talk about climate change, we talk about biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss is often reflected in deforestation. Places like Indonesia, Brazil. Deforestation means that wood, most often used for fuel, is further away, more difficult to find. In many places in the global South, for example, women are responsible for collecting traditional fuels, something that can typically take 25 hours or more a week. The longer women go, the less time they have for domestic responsibilities, to earn money, to engage in politics or other public activities, and to learn to read and simply to rest with their families. Girls are sometimes kept home from school to help gather firewood, perpetuating a cycle of disempowerment. In addition, the longer women have to go for fuel makes them more vulnerable, both to injuries, but also to sexual harassment and assault. Women are also more vulnerable because of the effects of climate change on water, right? So we know that climate change affects fresh water and the ability and the accessibility of water. Potable water. Again, in many countries, women are responsible for getting water. And women and girls pay the largest price, the heaviest price for poor water-based sanitation. So to give an example that got a good amount of press, in cases where groundwater is contaminated by arsenic, for instance, in the Ganges River Basin, which encompasses Indonesia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Tibet, increased flood levels intensify the rate of exposure among rural people and other socioeconomic disadvantaged groups. The resulting health problems, again from increased arsenic in the water, includes lesions, skin hardening, dark spots on hands and feet, swollen limbs, and loss of feeling in the limbs. Arsenic exposure is particularly tough on girls who are in turn physically shunned and stigmatized around the effects of and around the effects of arsenic, and then, of course, are more vulnerable to poverty, and have a more difficult time situating themselves in a marriage or in a household situation. So, and lastly, climate itself. So we know that climate affects the geographic distribution of infectious diseases, and weather influences the timing and severity of epidemics, right? So that diseases transmitted by mosquitoes, for example, are particularly sensitive to changes in climate. Rising temperatures are also likely to accelerate the life cycle of the malaria parasite and to spread malaria into new places. Flooding also increases with climate change, and it also increases the prevalence of waterborne diseases, which affect millions of people each year. And an increase in all of these diseases aggravates women's caregiving capacity, right, in the family. So gender and climate change go hand in hand. And a study by the International Union on the Conservation of Nature, conducted over 2 years, involving more than 1,000 sources of research, shows the same thing. Shows that gender-based violence and climate change goes hand in hand. According to the authors, we found gender-based violence to be pervasive, and there's enough clear evidence to suggest that climate change is increasing gender-based violence. Environmental degradation now affects our lives in ways that are becoming impossible to ignore, from food to jobs to security. The study shows that the damage humanity is inflicting on nature is also fueling violence against women and LGBTQ people in the US. Indigenous women experience some of the highest rates of violence of any women in the United States, making them particularly vulnerable to escalating rates of domestic and sexual violence that have been documented after natural disasters or weather-related crises. And we have seen documented that weather-related disasters have shown to increase sexual trafficking by 20 to 30%. Globally, about 12 million more young girls are thought to have been married off after increasing natural disasters. And from the report that I just mentioned, the IUCN report, interesting, some of the data is based on stories of girls. And one of the stories is a girl, Natoya Sandi, 13 years old in Malawi, when she got married against her will. Her quote is, "I was sent to be married because of a shortage of food in the house. Her parents used to have a small plot of land, but floods wiped out their harvest." She says, "I tried to negotiate to tell my parents that I wasn't ready, that I didn't want to get married, but they told me that I had to because it would mean one less mouth at the table." Relationships have also been found among environmental degradation, climate change, terrorism, and gender-based violence. The changing environmental conditions in the Lake Chad Basin in northeastern Nigeria have been found to have aided the recruitment and the operations of Boko Haram, the jihadist terrorist organization based there. And you might remember in 2014, the group abducted 276 schoolgirls, and in 2018, another 100 schoolgirls. And the data shows that the climate crisis created conditions for the group to grow, survive, and thrive, and then to engage in increased militant attacks. So, an interesting study on conducted by the Women's Policy Research on New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina provides a really interesting case study. So at the time of Hurricane Katrina, 25.9%, so quarter of the women living in New Orleans were living below the poverty line. And as I said earlier, poverty matters because it limits the resources that we have to allow opportunities for escape or survival when escape is impossible. So the women who were interviewed for this study were residents of New Orleans in public housing at the time of Katrina. Few of them had cars, And under normal circumstances, they got around the city by walking or taking the bus or trolley. When the city flooded, after the levees broke, the women who could escape their homes were stranded unless they could find someone with an undamaged vehicle. So also, women share greater responsibility for childcare than men, often work at home, so in less well-constructed buildings. Women who were pregnant or recovering from childbirth had very limited mobility. Women also made up a greater proportion of the elderly, typically one of the groups with the highest mortality rate, especially in the case of New Orleans when hospitals weren't evacuated. Women also faced a higher risk of gender-based violence. The rate of gender-based violence, hold on here, rose from 4.6 per 100,000 per day to 16.3 per 100,000 per day 1 year after Hurricane Katrina. So increased by 4%, by increased times 4 a year after Katrina. Meanwhile, transgender people report discrimination in natural disaster responses as well. And one high profile case after Katrina saw a trans woman locked in a jail for days after she used the showers for women in a Texas shelter. So in the aftermath, when cities and homes must be rebuilt, women, trans, and non-binary people face the steepest climb to recovery, and the population of low-income single mothers in New Orleans dropped from 18,000 to 3,000 after Katrina, showing the difficulty of women, and particularly women in poverty, to recover. So what's really interesting is that equality plays a really important role here. That in general, women and children are 14 times more likely to die during a climate-related disaster than men, 14 times. Women accounted for 61% of the fatalities caused by the cyclone Nargis in Myanmar, 70 to 80% in the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, and 91% in the 1991 cyclone in Bangladesh. The London School of Economics did a study of 141 natural disasters, and they found that when men and women have equal economic and social rights, the same number of women and men die in disasters. However, when women do not enjoy economic and social rights equal to men, more women than men die in disasters. So, climate change and gender go hand in hand. And because women and LGBT folks are more vulnerable to climate change because we're on the front line of climate change, they've also been active agents in combating climate change, right? Across Indigenous communities, we see many women's groups involved with water rights because water plays such an important role in those communities. Right? Women are seen as the protectors of water traditionally, right? And so women play a role in defending water. To quote Mary Robinson, I love this quote, climate change activist, former president of Ireland, former UN High Commission for Human Rights. Climate change is a man-made problem and requires a feminist solution. Man-made is a generic term. It includes women. And a feminist solution definitely includes men. So what we want to do is put gender equality at the center of how we address the climate issue. We need men to recognize the many mistakes that have been made. We're not getting out of fossil fuels quickly enough, and we need to change much more rapidly. So this is where the idea of gender mainstreaming comes up. And I found this idea to be so sort of obvious and yet obvious. the notion that gender equity considerations are made at all levels of government or any organization, including the development process, policymaking, budgetary planning, and evaluation. So that means that in any solution, we need to think about how does this solution affect women, people of color, people in the most vulnerable of situations, right? And we think about gender mainstreaming in terms of financing. How is financing affected by gender? How is financing accessed in terms of men and women? What does technology look like? And how accessible is it? And who's involved with creating the technology? Who gets training? And what does that training look like? So we can also take this notion of gender and climate change action going hand in hand when we think about politics. Good time to talk about politics, right? Now that we're in our virtual Women's March. So in a large sample of countries, there has been, and most of us know this, and I love this, there has been documented a robust positive association between female participation, female representation in a country's parliament and the stringency of its climate change policies. The impact is statistically significant and economically meaningful. Female parliamentary representation results in lower carbon dioxide emissions. And across 131 countries that were reviewed, women in government positions were more likely to sign on to international treaties to reduce global warming than men. And of course, by the way, we know that studies have shown that female political representation, of course, also contributes to significant changes in domestic and international policies regarding health and education, around female needs, and around better quality of institutions and higher rates of economic growth. According to Women's Earth and Climate Action Network in the Global North, women have been found to be more likely to recycle, buy organic food and eco-labeled products, and place a higher value on energy-efficient transport. Survey research in Europe shows that women express more concern about climate change than men and are more willing to make sacrifices to reduce emissions. So, some people, Carol Gilligan at Harvard, for example, and other theorists of gender have socialized that differences are related to gender socialization, that girls are socialized to be kind and take the consideration of others into their decisions, right? We're taught to be cooperative and careful, values that are relevant in climate change action. Okay. Maybe. Data from the European states suggests that men identify with social roles that are performed in society that lead to increases in greenhouse gases, right? So construction, mining, engineer, all tend to be male-oriented professions. Then again, since the consequences of dramatic climate incidents have greater consequences for women, and we disproportionately bear the cost of climate change, women perhaps are best positioned to see the need. So at this point, just really quickly, I want to pay some kudos to the sheroes who have come before us, right? And the ones on whose shoulders we work. So Greta Thunberg, such sweet, lovely shoulders, 17-year-old Swedish activist, began protesting, we all know, outside the Swedish parliament about the need for climate change at the age of 15. By March 2019, 1.4 million students in 112 countries joined in her strike and protest for climate change. And of course, NASCA is involved in Fridays for Future, right? And the And the climate change, the shoe strikes are part of the Fridays for Future actions. Can't talk about gender and climate change without giving acclaim to Rachel Carson, right? The American marine biologist who documented and condemned the indiscriminate use of pesticides in her 1962 Silent Spring. Her work led to a nationwide ban on DDT for agricultural uses and helped inspire an environmental movement that led to the creation of the US Environmental Protection Agency. We have India Logan Riley, who is a Maori youth activist who has created the nonpartisan youth-led climate organization Te Ara Watu, which highlights the disproportionate effect of climate change on Indigenous people. Oh. We have Berto Saceres, Honduran rights activist, who organized the indigenous Lenca people and waged a grassroots campaign that successfully pressured the world's largest dam builder to pull out of the Agua Zarca Dam. The dam would have cut off water supply for drinking, for food, and medicine for hundreds of people, and violate their right to sustainably manage and live off their land. Carceres was assassinated in her home in 2016 by armed intruders. And of the three of the 8 men who were arrested have links to US trained paramilitary troops. Wangari Maathai, Mama Trees, Kenyan environmentalist, women's rights advocate, the first African woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. She founded the Green Belt movement that has planted 50 million trees, trained over 30,000 women in forestry, food processing, and beekeeping to help them earn income while preserving their land and resources. Vandana Shiva, the Indian food sovereign activist. She promotes biodiversity and advocates seed freedom. She rejects corporate patents on seeds and opposed golden rice, a breed of rice genetically engineered to biosynthesize beta carotene. Of course, I'd be remiss if we didn't mention Vandana Shiva's work with Maria Mies, ecofeminism. Ecofeminism is founded on the connections between the exploitation of nature and the oppression of women and other marginalized groups under prevailing system. As a contested product of this relationship, women are seen as natural and essential stewards of the environment. 1993. Ecofeminists reject false solutions. Those responses to climate change that are based on savior technologies and market solutions. So, gender and climate change go hand in hand. So today we celebrate the power of coming together and we strengthen our commitment. I am quoting Jenna and Carrie, we strengthen our commitment to serve the causes of justice and women's rights. Women lead the way, because addressing climate change is addressing gender equity. So I've got a final quote by Wangari Maathai: "Women are the key to climate's future." Woo!
Thank you, Frances. That's not the first time I've heard that, and every time I still get goosebumps and tears to my eyes. So thank you.
I get goosebumps.
So we have a few questions, and I'm gonna introduce Raina, who's a student here helping us. So Raina, you are welcome to go ahead and say hi, and we can start reading some of these questions in the chat box and keep them coming. So thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Raina, and I am a senior at NAU, and I'm also part of the Fridays for Future and Flagstaff, and also the Flagstaff Shoe Strike events. So yeah, happy to be here. And I'm seeing 4 questions in the chat right now. First one asked by Sydney. Oh, sorry, I lost it. The first one is, what was the motivation behind why terrorist organizations were abducting young schoolgirls?
So, well, Boko Haram, of course, and many of these sort of radical groups grew because just step back from that question 1 second, because of course climate change shifts agricultural patterns, right? It disrupts livelihoods, fewer jobs are available. So joining a terrorist group, right? Joining a group of guys who get guns, who go around and get the fruits of war become that those activities become more and more alluring when you've got nothing else going on in your life, right? So so there are clear links between climate change and the growth of these terrorist organizations, particularly Boko Haram in Northern Africa. Why did they go around kidnapping and raping schoolgirls, and forcing them to marry them? I think there is a long-standing relationship between gender violence and war, right? Gender violence and genocide. And so schoolgirls then get caught up in, right? Women get caught up in war and terrorism as it increases.
All right. The next question is from Beverly, asking, is there any place in the world where men and women are equal economically?
Well, apparently all those Scandinavian countries that always end up being in the top 10 of the happiest countries in the world have higher representation, higher participation of women in their parliaments, and also have a greater gender equity in terms of pay, in terms of the quality of work, in terms of leave time, right? So yes. Although, of course, some countries have, and this sort of speaks to your question, Beverly, but sort of skirts it. Many countries have gender quotas for their parliaments, right? So there needs to be a minimum number or proportion of women in parliamentary bodies. I found that to be shocking when I first read that, because it is so very different than any ideas we have in the United States about representation. And yet, if you want representation and you believe the data that shows that participation increases policies, particular kinds of policies, then I think those kinds of strategic organizational structures make sense. Yeah, we're always like 23rd on the list. We do need more women in leadership. That is true. That is very true.
Okay, next one. Oh, I lost my place. This one's from Sydney again. Is caring about the environment a gender role of being female?
So it seems that there's a correlation between gender and concern for the environment. Is it because women are raised to have concerns about the environment? Maybe. Is it because men find themselves in jobs that are attached to non-renewable resources? Possibly. Is it because women and other more vulnerable groups have experienced the impact of climate change? I think all those things, right? Should women be more involved? No, I'd say everybody should be involved in climate change, right? Climate change in any kind of struggle for justice, climate justice, racial justice, gender. We should all, social reproduction or reproductive rights, we should all be involved.
All right, next one is from Jenna. What is the relationship between policymaking, patriarchy, and climate change?
Yeah. So same thing, right? When there are more women in decision-making capacity. So I think we can't pull up like examples like Margaret Thatcher and say, well, she was a woman and things went very badly then. So I think it's not thinking about a single designating the role for a single person, but when more women participate in parliament, we see more legislation more legislation around climate action. Why? For any of the things that we talked about before.
Right.
And I think we see this in our own House and Senate, right? The folks who we see this whole crop now of women who are single mothers, right? Who are now in Congress, and they have a very different view of the world and a different view of what policies we need to support, right? Because our lives are different.
All right, next one. What is an example of a savior technique to climate change?
Oh yeah, Peggy, that's yours, right? I think that's great. So generally, the eco-feminists talk about any of the kind of like carbon credits, those kinds of things. Anything that I think they would even say like private sector solar panel people, like anybody who sort of jumps on the capitalist bandwagon to solve climate change. I think that all would be incorporated under the kinds of things that ecofeminists say are sort of putting band-aids on the situation rather than addressing the fundamental sort of structural causes, right? The argument is that we have to shift the way we engage in the world rather than use the same tools to fix what the tools broke.
All right, this one's from Peter. For those of us teaching at a university level environmental science regarding climate and want to incorporate this content in our curriculum, do you have a modest bibliography you could share with us to diversify our text, authors, and perspectives?
I do, and I can put it in the chat. Were this a face-to-face session, I would be passing out papers, but I guess so much better to do it electronically anyway, right? Yeah, so I'll put something in the chat. I do have some resources, and thanks. And there is, there's a growing understanding that we need to, that we can't think about climate action without thinking about climate justice, right?
I'm not seeing any more questions unless anyone has any last minute ones they want to type
We're
in.
excellent in terms of time anyway.
Perfect. So thank you. And we do have, I think Carrie just put it in the chat box, some more kind of discussion coming up. So thank you so much, Raina. And to kind of start off this next part, the first thing we're going to do is stop recording, and then we're going to have